Here is an article that I got from a classical teacher's journal website, and it discusses the story structure of Godfather's Death. So it talks about how Godfather's Death is definitely not what you would call a Disney tale, where everybody lives happily ever after. It says that Godfather's tale is pretty much an anti-fairy tale, but this tale is perfect for a classical literature classroom. So I'm going to go over and also this article goes over the story structure of Godfather's Death. And so remember that when we do story structure, we have a triggering event, then we have a rising action, climax, falling action, and then resolution. Triggering event is the first event that starts off the story. Rising action means all of the events leading up to the climax, where you build on the suspense and the character gets more and more in trouble. Then you build to the climax, which is the most intense point in the story. Then you have falling action, where the hero starts to have resolve the problem. And then you have the resolution. So let's go over this really interesting article on Godfather's Death. Disney has pretty much figured out what makes a fairy tale worth turning into a full-length feature film. It needs to have a likable protagonist. Remember, a protagonist is the main character. A worthy struggle for said protagonist, and of course a happily ever after ending. Godfather Death does not have any of these things. Its main character is self-serving. His struggle is to advance himself in society. And, spoiler alert, he dies in the end. It's not exactly Disney material. In fact, it's not exactly a fairy tale either. Godfather's Death is actually an anti-fairy tale, meaning it pivots around the punishments of succumbing to vice instead of the rewards of pursuing virtue. As such, they were traditionally told to warn children and even scare them from going astray. Similar to when you would tell children boogie tales, to keep the boogeyman away. Though Godfather's Death doesn't fit into the Disney paradigm, it works extremely well in a classical classroom. Not only does it give insight into the medieval mindset, but it also poses many powerful questions about justice, truth, and equality that can still be applied today. Plus, it makes for great classroom dramatizations. Let's take a look at the plot first and then address some of those larger issues. And so when we go over story structure, we're looking at the plot of the story. We're looking at the events of what happened in the story. Exposition, which is triggering event. In other words, what is the background of this story? How does this story start out? What is the backstory of the story? So at the outset of the story, we learn that a 13th child has been born to a very poor family. Then you have inciting incident, which in other words, triggering event. The problem. As if another mouth to feed wasn't problem enough for the parents, they are also at a loss over whom to name as their son's godfather. Rising action. That's the build-up to the climax. Unlike many parents today who might make a short list of candidates to be vetted, the father simply decides to choose the first person he meets on the street. It's not that the father is reckless, but that he's desperate. After all, he's probably tapped all of his connections on his first 12 kids. As luck would have it, father meets God himself. We might expect that to be the end of the story, with the son being blessed to live happily ever after. But the father foolishly turns God down, saying, "Thou givest to the rich and leavest the poor to hunger." No sooner does God leave than the devil offers to the son's godfather. The father turns him down as well, saying, "Thou deceivest men and leadest them astray." Finally, death offers himself as the godfather and even promotes riches for the child. The father replies, "Thou art the right one. Thou takest from the rich as well as the poor, without distinction. thou shalt be godfather. Death then takes the boy into his special guardianship and mentors him to become a doctor, but not an ordinary doctor with ordinary medicine. Instead, Death shows his godson a special plant that can be used to heal the sick. The one caveat is that Death will always dictate who gets the medicine. It is up to him who will get to be saved and who must die. Death says, if I stand by the head of the sick man, thou may make him well again. If thou giveth him this plant, he will recover. But if I stand by the patient's feet, he is mine, and all thou remedies are in vain. So this is the rising action, is that Death raises this young child to be a doctor, and that Death determines who dies and who lives, depending on whether or not Death is standing by the foot of the patient or the head of the patient. Climax is the breaking point. So here you have a doctor who could heal anybody, and as long as he obeys his godfather, he's able to be a successful doctor. But then the one time he decides to disobey his godfather, and that's when that's when the doctor pays the price with his life. So the climax is the actual disobedience. Their partnership thrives for a long time, and the godson becomes rich and famous. Then he foolishly decides to cheat Death by saving someone's death Death wants to claim. Death warns the godson not to do it again, but the godson can't resist the urge to save a princess on her deathbed, for whoever does so is promised her hand in marriage. And so he thinks that if he saves her, he could be the lady's husband. So he gets carried away and forgets his promise to his godfather, and he forgets that if he breaks that promise to his godfather, there would be consequences. Instead, all he thinks about is himself. So that's the climax, is when he disobeys the promise that he made to his godfather, Death. Falling action is action that leads to the resolution. Just like the rising action is action that leads to the conclusion, action that leads to the climax, falling action is action that leads to the conclusion. Though Death lets the princess live, he declares that he must have the godson's life in her place. Resolution, not so happily ever after. True to his word, Death takes his godson into a deep cave below the earth. The cave is full of candles, each representing someone's life. The godson realizes that his candle is just about to go out and begs Death to light him a new one. Death acts like he is going to, but cruelly stomps his godson's candle out. A lesson on, so here we have the entire plot. So the plot is usually exposition, then rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. And so after we look at the plot of a story, then we want to look at the theme. So what are the different themes of this story? So the theme of this story is a lesson on virtue. So themes mean the central lesson or the moral of the story or the central idea. In other words, why did this author write this story? What does this story teach us? And so the Middle Ages was full of poor big families like the one in Godfather's Death. When we realize just how desperate their plot often was, it is hard not to sympathize with the father in the story. He wants to provide for his family but can't. What's more, he has grown bitter about his lot in life, and he quite literally turns his back on God. That causes him to have a distorted view of the meaning of justice, truth, and equality. He displays his misunderstanding of each of these virtues in turn when he meets the prospective godparents. His interaction with God revolves around justice, or the state of getting what one deserves. No doubt the father felt he deserved better in life. Let's assume he is a hard worker, as many fathers in the Middle Ages must have been. Yet he clearly has not gotten what he deserves for his effort. Instead, his life is full of hardship, and he blames God. His interaction with the devil focuses on truth, which is seeing things for what they are. The Father knows the devil is a liar and does not want that for his Son. Yet although he turns the devil down and he tries to walk away from his lies, the Father has already figuratively embraced the devil's lies in that he believes God unjust, which is not true. The Father is so confused that he ends up believing death a true representative of equality. After all, doesn't everybody die, whether rich or poor, good or bad? In that simplistic sense, death does indeed appear the great equalizer. So when you read a lot of European literature in the Middle Ages, it was a common belief that death was the great equalizer. And if you read the letters of Montesquieu, he talks about the same thing, about how you have a lot of people who are very, very rich, that when they're on earth, they have an easy life. Then you have people on earth who are very, very poor, and they don't have easy life, and they can't even eat. And you have such inequality between the poor and the rich. And so, but then death is the great equalizer because everybody dies, rich or poor. And this thematic was very, very common in medieval literature of this time period, Montesquieu. So when this author wrote Godfather's Death, he really is writing about the medieval mindset of how you would think that, and I think that when you talk about God, he's talking mainly about the church. I mean, in the medieval literature, they would say that the church is what's corrupt, not God, and that and so therefore the one thing that would make everything just is death. So that's a very common theme in medieval literature. Equality is not just about making everything the same in a quantifiable way. It's much more fundamentally about recognizing the equality of everyone based on their dignity as a child of God. And so basically, the truth is, we are all the same, not because we all die, but because we all go to heaven, and we are all children of God, and that we are all made in his image. And so that is true equality. So equality is derived from the love God has for us. Paradoxically, the more we lessen ourselves through humility and obedience, the greater our love is returned to God. In other words, we are stewards of God's kingdom, just like I mentioned in the previous lecture. And it is up to us to take care of each other because we are all God's children. And that's what really makes us equal. Rags to riches and back again. Like Cinderella, this story has a rags to riches motif, but the eventual wealth and fame of the godson is neither to his credit nor is it lasting. Instead, it was born out of making a deal of sorts with death. True, his dad made it on his behalf in the first place, but the godson is complicit nonetheless in that he goes along with it as he grows. If we look at this from the godson's perspective, we might say that he was trapped. By his family, just as many children in the Middle Ages must have felt. If the father was poor, so too would be the son. While the godson in this story escapes his father's poverty, he does not escape his father's distorted view of the world. Like him, the godson does not understand the meaning of justice, truth, and equality. He thinks he deserves his wealth, and yet he is willing to lie to attain it. What's more, he wants death to treat him differently than others simply because he is his grandson. Such exceptions would have been the very thing his birth father would have deplored. As my students heartily agree, the godson gets what he deserves in the end. While none seem to like that he dies, it is a fitting sort of justice. With death as a godfather, he should not have expected a long life, or he should not have expected life. So this is an interesting story to discuss about what exactly is truth, what exactly is equality, and what exactly is goodness. And this makes for an interesting topic. And when we discuss this in the forum, you can ask other students at the end of your post, do you agree with what the godson did? Do you agree that death is the great equalizer? Or do you think that God and God's love for us is the great equalizer? So herein ends this lecture, and you can ask all these thematic questions at the end of your posts in order to keep the conversation going. And so if you have any questions, you can always email me.